You wake up, maybe before the sun, maybe to a soft alarm, maybe to a song you are already tired of. You reach for a glowing rectangle on the nightstand. You check the time. You check your messages. You walk into a bathroom where clean water appears because you turned a handle. You stand under hot water that came from pipes hidden in walls. You rub soap on your skin. You scrape your teeth with nylon bristles. You look in a mirror and adjust the face you plan to show the world. Then coffee, cold milk, a sealed packet, a fridge humming in the corner like a domesticated winter. Shoes, keys, maybe a car, maybe a train, maybe a map talking to you from your pocket. Step by step, your morning is a stack of invisible systems so ordinary you barely notice them. Now remove the phone, remove the clock, remove the pipes, remove the mirror, remove the toothbrush, remove the floor, remove the power grid, the street, the fridge, the supermarket, the asphalt, the antibiotic, the lock on the door, the idea of a door as you know it. Keep going. Remove the smell of detergent. Remove the confidence that fresh means safe. Remove the confidence that walls mean home. Remove the confidence that your body, your habits, your idea of normal would make any sense at all to somebody living 30,000 years ago. What would be left of you? Not your profile, not your opinions, not your playlist or passwords. Just traces. A print in mud, wear on a tooth, a notch in wood, pigment on stone, bones in a cave, maybe the shape of how you handled the dead. Maybe the strange fact that you carried certain skulls and not others. Maybe a child pressing a hand into soft mineral crust. Because being alive is sometimes so immediate, you want to leave a mark. That is the first reframe tonight. Prehistory did not leave us stories in sentences. It left us functions. A footprint was not a footprint. It was movement, balance, weight, urgency. A grave was not automatically grief. It could be smell management, predator management, memory, ritual, love, fear, or all of them mixed together so tightly that even now we cannot separate them. Art was not a painting in a museum. Art might have been practice, play, status, signaling, trance, identity, or just a child with time and wet stone. Clean did not mean smelling like citrus. Clean meant low parasite load. Warm did not mean thermostat. Warm meant the fire was still alive at dawn. And once you look at the prehistoric world that way, 10 mysteries start to feel less like 10 weird facts from a dusty museum and more like 10 punches to the modern ego. Because again and again, the evidence suggests ancient people and ancient human relatives were doing things that do not fit our neat little ladder of progress. They were appearing earlier than expected, thinking in ways we do not fully understand, making structures we did not think they could make, and leaving behavior behind that feels uncomfortably familiar in one moment and completely alien in the next. The first mystery begins under your feet. Number 1. White sands and the footprints that should not be there. If you saw a set of footprints on a beach, you would not call that history. You would call it a sign that someone was just there. That is what makes white sands so unnerving. In what is now New Mexico, preserved in layers of ancient sediment, scientists found human footprints dated to around 23 to 21,000 years ago. Not little rumor dates. Not a maybe if everything lines up date. A serious, ugly, argument-starting date. Why ugly? Because for a long time, one of the simplest stories in American prehistory went like this. Humans arrived later, after the worst of the last glacial maximum, and spread through the continents in a timeline that felt manageable. White sands shoved a boot straight through that comfort. If those dates hold, and newer work strongly suggests they do, then people were in North America during one of the harshest cold periods of the Ice Age. That means somebody was moving through a landscape of drying lake margins, giant animals, unstable climate, and real risk much earlier than a lot of people were ready to accept. And here is the redefinition. A footprint was not evidence of travel. It was evidence of belonging. That sounds small, but it is not. Travel is temporary. Belonging means you know how to survive there. You know the water. You know the mud. You know what season does to the ground. You know where children can walk and where they sink. Some of the white sands prints appear to come from teenagers and children, which is maybe the most haunting detail of all. Adults make sense to us. Adults are the ones we imagine doing bold prehistoric things. But children mean routine. Children mean this was not just one dramatic lonely explorer throwing himself at a frozen continent for the plot. It suggests a social world, families, task sharing, the ordinary chaos of group life, And then the dating fight began, because of course it did. The original dates came from seeds of an aquatic plant. Critics asked a fair question: what if those plants absorbed ancient carbon from the water and looked older than they really were? That is not a nitpick. That is the kind of thing prehistory lives and dies on. But later work used terrestrial pollen from the same layers and luminescence dating of the sediments, and the broader picture held up. The prints still look ancient, still inconvenient, still there. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. If your whole model of the peopling of the Americas can be shaken by a few steps in mud, how much of your certainty is just the current arrangement of surviving evidence? For the people who made those tracks, home did not mean ownership papers or a street name. Home meant a landscape your body could read: wet ground, dry edges, game trails, shelter, wind direction, thin ice, thirst. The mystery is not only who they were and how they got there. The deeper mystery is how many human presences have vanished simply because the ground did not feel like keeping them. Number 2. Denisovans, the human relatives we know mostly from teeth for years. Denisovans were almost insulting in how little they gave us. A finger bone, a few teeth, a jaw, scattered fragments. Enough for ancient DNA to tell us they existed, but not enough to let us picture them like proper people. Imagine knowing a human group changed the genetics of living populations across Asia and Oceania, then realizing you can barely sketch a face. That is not just a missing fossil problem. That is a missing chapter of what being human looked like. A name can fool you here. Denis often sounds tidy because we gave it a tidy label, but to the people living then, this was not a category in a textbook. It was neighbors, rivals, lovers, kin, strangers, maybe all depending on time and place. And the mystery has only grown stranger. Genetic evidence showed Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of some living people, especially populations in parts of Asia and Oceania. So they were not some evolutionary side note tucked safely away in a cave. They were woven into the human story in a real biological way. Yet physically, they remained ghost-like. Then the fossil picture started getting less foggy. A jaw from the Tibetan Plateau, other finds across East Asia. And more recently, a major twist. DNA from hardened plaque on the Harbin skull, the so-called Dragon Man skull, helped confirm that this massive face was Denisovan. Pause there, because that sentence alone would have sounded ridiculous not long ago. Scientists pulled genetic clues from fossilized tooth plaque to help put a face on one of our most mysterious relatives. That is prehistoric detective work bordering on black magic. And what kind of face? The evidence suggests a big, broad, robust human relative, thick-boned, heavy jaw, large teeth, probably built powerfully, especially in colder environments. Not some half-finished version of us, not a caveman cartoon. A successful form of human adapted to a huge sweep of Asia. Maybe some Denisovan groups looked different from others too. They ranged across radically different environments, from cold highlands to warmer regions. We do not yet know how much that diversity showed up in their bodies. Here is the reframe. A tooth was not just a tooth. It was a passport stamp. Teeth carry diet, development, ancestry, even chemical traces of environment. Plaque, gross as it sounds, can become a microscopic archive. Clean did not mean polished enamel and peppermint breath. Clean meant your mouth had not yet turned into an infection severe enough to pull your whole life down. In deep time, the mouth was not cosmetic. It was survival equipment. And now those same old mouths are informing us that a population we once knew from scraps may have been physically imposing, regionally widespread, and much more visible in the fossil record than we realized. But that only sharpens the mystery. Where are their complete skeletons? How tall were they really? How variable were they? What did children look like? Did different Denisovan populations behave differently, speak differently, bury differently? We have the shadow of a people across genomes and fragments, but not yet a full room lit up. And maybe that is the deeper insult Denisovans deliver to modern confidence. You can change the DNA of millions of future humans and still almost disappear. Number 3. Homo floresiensis and the tiny human relative. That should not make sense if Denisovans force us to imagine a large, rugged human we barely know. Homo floresiensis does the opposite. It takes the human shape and compresses it until your instincts start protesting. The so-called hobbits of Flores were tiny. Really tiny. The kind of tiny that made some scientists when they were first discovered, wonder whether the fossils belonged not to a separate species, but to a sick modern human. A disorder, a pathology, something easier to accept. Because that felt safer than admitting the human family had room for a very small-bodied, small-brained relative living, surprisingly late in time on an island in Indonesia. That easier explanation has not held up well. Newer fossils, including an arm bone described in 2024 from older deposits on Flores, push the weirdness deeper. The bone belonged to an adult and suggests an even smaller individual, around a meter tall. These earlier fossils indicate that very small-bodied hominins were on Flores hundreds of thousands of years ago, so this was not a late, isolated, unhealthy accident. Smallness was the plan, or at least the outcome that kept winning. And that triggers one of the most delicious mysteries in human evolution. Why? One strong idea is island dwarfism. On isolated islands with limited resources, large animals often get smaller over time. You do not need a big body if a big body is expensive and food is inconsistent. That part makes broad biological sense. The problem is that humans are not deer. Humans bring tools, social strategies, learning, flexibility. So when you look at Homo floresiensis, you are looking at a body plan that seems to say yes, even humans can be radically reshaped by place, but there are still arguments. Some researchers see a dwarf descendant of Homo erectus, which had already spread through parts of Asia. Others are not convinced that the ancestry is that simple. The wrists and some skull features feel primitive in ways that make the family tree wobble. And then there is the question that feels almost rude in its obviousness. How did they get to Flores in the first place? The island was not exactly a casual walk away. Water mattered. Sea crossings mattered. Even if accidental rafting played a role, you still end up with a human lineage marooned, adapting, enduring, and becoming something small and utterly its own. So here is the redefinition. Primitive did not mean simple. Primitive meant unfamiliar engineering. A small body is not a failed large body. It is a body that solved a different equation. To the hobbits of Flores, efficiency may have mattered more than scale. Less food, different mobility, different risks, different payoffs. We are still feeling around the edges of that answer. And while they lived on that island, they did so among Komodo dragons, giant rats, and a whole ecosystem that does not care whether your species makes sense to later museum visitors. Ask yourself this. If you met a meter-tall human relative with a tiny brain case and stone tools, what exactly would make you call them lesser? Size? Skull volume? Familiarity? Because that is a modern bias talking. In prehistory, successful was not the same thing as impressive-looking. Number 4. Kalambo Falls. And the wooden constructure 500,000 years too early stone dominates our imagination of prehistory because stone survives. It sits there stubbornly, waiting to be found, while wood usually rots back into silence. That survival bias has quietly warped the whole way we picture early humans. We say Stone Age and imagine a world of rock, as if ancient people were obsessed with stone instead of simply being betrayed by the archaeological record. Then Kalambo Falls in Zambia throws another punch. There, archaeologists found interlocking logs shaped with a notch and dated to around 476,000 years ago, nearly 500,000 years old, before Homo sapiens even appears. Not just a sharpened stick, not just a branch used once and tossed. A fitted wooden structure. Sit with that for a second. Somebody, not us in the strict species sense, looked at wood and saw joinery. This is where the modern picture of intelligence starts to creak. We tend to imagine early cognition as a staircase with stone tools at the bottom, symbolic thought somewhere higher up, and proper building much later. But a notched, interlocking structure suggests planning, materials knowledge, sequencing, and a reason to alter the environment beyond the immediate moment. Maybe it was part of a platform over wet ground. Maybe a raised surface for work or rest. The exact function is still debated. But whatever the purpose, it was not random hacking. And here is the reframe. Architecture did not mean walls and roofs. Architecture meant changing a landscape so your body suffers less in it. That is such a human move it almost hurts. Drying the wet, leveling the awkward, elevating yourself above mud, pests, cold seep, and discomfort. Not glamorous, just smart. Home again did not mean a mailbox. Home meant your knees were not in swamp water while you worked. There is also something almost unfair about this discovery. How many wooden structures vanished because the preservation conditions were not exceptional? How much complexity have we denied ancient humans simply because the wrong materials survived? If waterlogged conditions near a waterfall had not protected those logs, we might still be telling a cleaner, flatter story, in which structural woodworking shows up much later and feels more safely ours. And look at how modern that bias is. We still equate sophistication with what leaves durable monuments: steel, concrete, glass. But if the prehistoric world was full of wood, fiber, hide, cordage, baskets, traps, shelters, platforms, and tools that mostly disappeared, then the absence of evidence has been doing quiet propaganda for generations. A structure, in that older world, was not a statement piece. It was a body trick, a way to spend less energy, a way to stay drier, a way to control space. Once you see it that way, 500,000 years no longer feels impossibly early. It feels like the kind of thing problem-solving apes with hands would eventually do. Number 5. The Quesang handprints and the fonts ability that children helped invent art at a hot spring site in Tibet called Quesang. Researchers found handprints and footprints pressed into travertine, dated to somewhere between roughly 169,000 and 226,000 years ago. The likely makers were children. That alone is enough to stop you. Not master artists under torchlight, not solemn elders performing ritual. Children, and the debate is beautiful because it is really a debate about what counts as human expression. Were these the oldest known examples of parietal art? Were they intentional compositions? Or were they simply playful pressing in soft material that happened to preserve? Some researchers argue the arrangement looks deliberate, that the traces were not made by normal walking, that they resemble the careful way a child might press a hand into wet cement. Others are skeptical and think calling it art stretches the term beyond what the evidence can support. But watch what happens when you change the definition. Art did not mean framed beauty. Art meant non-utilitarian attention. That does not sound as romantic, but it is actually more radical, because it asks a prehistoric question, not a museum question. Did someone stop doing the immediate practical thing and instead arrange marks for no obvious survival reason? Was there play, display, memory, pleasure, or a proto-symbolic impulse there? If the answer is yes, even tentatively, the scene changes. You are no longer watching locomotion. You are watching intention spread out in time. And children matter here more than you might think. Children are not failed adults. In every human society, they are experimental creatures. They test textures. They repeat actions. They play with pattern, sound, rhythm, mess. If early art has a childish component, that should not lower it. It might explain it. Some of the oldest traces of symbolic life may not have begun in cathedral seriousness. They may have begun in curiosity, sticky fingers, and the joy of leaving evidence that you were there. The prehistoric world was full of surfaces your body had to read directly. Not screens, not polished counters, stone that tears skin, clay that sucks at your heel, ash that stains, grease that clings, blood that darkens, hot mineral crusts where a careless step burns. Touch mattered in a way our sealed modern lives barely remember. So when a child presses a hand into soft travertine, that is not abstract. That is body meeting world with full seriousness. And here is the sharper hit. If those prints count as art, then the origins of art might not begin with genius. They might begin with play disciplined by memory. If they do not count as art, then maybe our modern definition is the thing failing, not the evidence. Either way, the mystery remains. We like origins to look official. We like ceremonies and masterpieces. Prehistory keeps whispering that a lot of the deep human story may have begun with somebody fooling around and meaning it more than we can prove. Teach per 6. Shanidar cave and daughter Neanderthals cared for their dead. One of the easiest lies modern people tell themselves is that burial is obvious. Body in a place equals ritual. Bones clustered together equals grief. But death in prehistory is slippery. Bodies fall into holes. Animals drag parts around. Sediment shifts. Caves collapse. Hyenas interfere. Water moves things. And yet some sites keep suggesting behavior that feels more deliberate than chance. Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan is one of those places. Neanderthal remains were found there decades ago. And the site has never stopped disturbing the boundary between they probably cared and prove it. A more recent individual known as Shanidar Z adds to the tension. The body was found in a context that suggests repeated use of the same cave area for the dead. There are hints of intentional placement, maybe even digging, though researchers are careful about the words they use. Not everyone is comfortable leaping straight to grave or cemetery, and that caution matters. But here is the redefinition. Burial did not necessarily mean religion. Burial meant managing the relationship between the living and the dead. That relationship can include grief, yes. It can include respect. It can also include smell, fear, memory, a desire not to attract predators, a need to return to a meaningful place. In many traditional human societies, death is not one event but a process, and the handling of the body can be practical and symbolic at once. Why would Neanderthals need to fit neatly into one box? There is also the famous flower burial debate hanging over Shanidar like a ghost. Pollen found near earlier Neanderthal remains inspired claims that flowers had been placed with the dead. Critics later argued the pollen could have come from burrowing animals or contamination. That debate still has a pulse, because once you suggest flowers, you are no longer just discussing disposal. You are discussing sentiment, intention, maybe even ceremony. And everybody gets nervous around those words because they feel so human, by which I mean so modernly proprietary. But what if that is exactly the problem? To us, a funeral is often a cultural script. Scheduled, packaged, florists, black clothes, speeches, paperwork. To them, if the evidence suggests anything like deliberate mortuary behavior, it would have been rawer. Closer to the smell of the body, closer to the cave air, closer to the actual labor of moving the dead and deciding where they belong in a landscape still shared with carnivores. This is the part where you should ask the uncomfortable question. If you died in a Neanderthal world, what about your modern habits would help you? Your skincare? Your passwords? Your office ID? None of it. But people around you deciding to carry you, place you, return to that place again, that would matter. That is the ancient core, not the formal language of mourning, the action. And maybe that is why Shanidar still grips scientists. It is not just a technical problem about sediments and skeleton position. It is a threat to a cherished boundary. We want compassion, ritualized care, an attachment to the dead to feel uniquely ours. The cave keeps refusing to cooperate. Number 7. Göbekli Tepe, and the monument that arrived before the script Göbekli Tepe sits in southeastern Turkey and feels even now like a site designed specifically to annoy easy stories. It is more than 11,000 years old. Older than Stonehenge by an absurd margin, massive T-shaped pillars, animal carvings, monumental enclosures, geometry, planning. The kind of place that makes you expect a city around it, or at least a nice clean explanation. Instead, what you get is a harder, stranger possibility. People who were still very close to the hunter-gatherer world built something huge before the social packages we usually think of as necessary for that scale had fully settled into place. And here is the redefinition. Religion did not mean doctrine. Religion meant coordinated awe. Even if that word turns out too heavy, the point stands. Gather enough people, enough labor, enough food, enough shared meaning, and you can build a place that is more than a camp and not yet a city. Some researchers see ritual focus here. Some emphasize social gathering. Some argue the architecture shows sophisticated geometric planning, suggesting the structures were conceived as part of a larger design rather than improvised over time. That alone is wild. Geometry this early, this deliberate on this scale, means minds working with abstraction and collective execution long before many older narratives were comfortable allowing it. And still, the purpose remains slippery. Temple, meeting ground, seasonal gathering point, social magnet, a place where the dead, the animals, and the human imagination were all being organized into something new? Notice how modern your confusion is. We assume big building follows settled life, surplus, hierarchy, administration. First villages, then monuments. First agriculture, then giant sacred architecture. Göbekli Tepe keeps hinting that maybe collective belief-like behavior, or at least collective meaning, was not a byproduct of civilization. Maybe it helped create civilization. That is the flip. To them, a pillar was not a ruin to be. It was a machine for alignment, aligning people, memory, effort, narrative, fear, seasonal return, identity. And no, that does not mean we should fill the gaps with fantasy. Not aliens, not lost super civilizations. The real mystery is better. The real mystery is that humans with stone tools, animal knowledge, and intense social lives may have been fully capable of organizing labor around ideas powerful enough to move tons of stone before our preferred script says they should. Think about your own world for a second. Stadiums, memorials, skyscrapers, data centers, giant houses of worship. We still build oversized structures to stabilize invisible things. Power, meaning, belonging, memory. The materials changed. The emotional technology did not number 8. Cueva Des-Cubierta and the Neanderthal cave of animal heads at Cueva Des-Cubierta in Spain. Neanderthals appear to have brought the crania of large hoofed animals into a cave space, often near hearths, not full carcasses. Not the meaty bits you would expect if ordinary subsistence were the whole story. Just the heads, heavily represented, with other body parts underrepresented in ways that made researchers stop and stare. This is where prehistoric behavior becomes almost offensively ambiguous. If you found a room full of animal heads in a modern context, your imagination would sprint. Trophy room, ritual, intimidation, decoration, identity display. But with Neanderthals, many people still want the safest answer possible, because the alternative implies symbolic behavior in a species long caricatured as strong but mentally dim. The researchers argue the cave assemblage does not look like natural accumulation, not like carnivore activity, and not like ordinary butchery. Experimental work suggests that if the heads had simply been processed there in a straightforward utilitarian way, you would expect more of certain skull and jaw fragments than were found. Instead, the pattern suggests selective transport. The heads were brought in. So here is the reframe. A skull was not leftovers. It was emphasis, maybe trophy emphasis, maybe ritual emphasis, maybe some relationship with fire, animals, memory, danger, or hunting identity that we do not yet have the right words for. The site has been called a possible symbolic accumulation, but even that phrase feels too clean for how weird it really is. Imagine the smell. Burned fat, damp stone, hair singed from hide, bone cracked open elsewhere, then heads carried inward into a cave space that kept collecting them. That is not just food processing. That is attention with a pattern. This is where the perspective really begins to tilt, because from their point of view, your modern home is full of equally symbolic object behavior that would look bizarre in excavation. Why do you keep the skull-like faces of dead animals mounted on walls? Why do you place photographs of absent people in central domestic zones? Why do you build fireless kitchens, sleep on raised foam, and preserve the ashes of your dead in decorative containers? Symbolic life always looks strange when it is not yours. That is the big flip, and it lands hard around here. In the prehistoric world, you would be the weird one. Your smell of soap would be unnatural. Your soft feet would be embarrassing. Your inability to track or butcher or identify weather from air pressure would make you delicate. Your refusal to touch the dead directly would seem peculiar in one context, ordinary in another. You think they are alien because you are judging by modern default settings. But default settings are local. They are not universal. Number 9. Homo naledi and the small-brained species that refuses to stay simple. Take Homo naledi. Found deep in South Africa's Rising Star cave system, this species already looked like a challenge to simple narratives. A small-brained hominin with a strange mix of primitive and human-like features, living between about 335,000 and 241,000 years ago. The very location of the bodies was a mystery from the beginning. How did so many remains end up deep in a hard-to-access chamber? Were the bodies deliberately placed? Did some natural process move them? Were these early mortuary behaviors? Then the debate got hotter. Claims emerged that Homo naledi may have intentionally buried some of their dead, maybe even engraved cave walls. That would be a major shock because their brains were small, closer in size to something you would not automatically pair with such complex symbolic behavior. Critics pushed back hard. Some argued the evidence does not yet prove true burial. Some said natural depressions and later sediment processes can imitate intentional graves. Others pointed to the engravings and asked the most brutal archaeological question of all: how do you know who made them? As if that were not enough. From a 2026 protein study of teeth from at least 20 Homo naledi individuals added a fresh twist. Researchers looking for a protein marker, usually associated with biological males, found none in the sampled teeth. None. That could mean the assemblage was all female, which would be astonishing. Or it could mean Homo naledi males lacked that marker because of some genetic quirk. Either option is weird. Either option deepens the mystery. And here is the redefinition. Intelligence did not mean looking like us while thinking like us. Intelligence meant solving recurring problems with the body and brain available. That matters because brain size has become a lazy visual shorthand. Big brain, complex behavior. Small brain, limited behavior. But evolution is not that polite. Neural organization matters. Social structure matters. Niche matters. Learned tradition matters. A small-brained hominin repeatedly placing bodies, if that is what happened, would not be a cute exception. It would be a warning label on simplistic theories of cognition. And once more, imagine the bodily reality, squeezing through dark passages. Torchlight or firelight if fire was involved. The drag of a body. The scrape of knees. Air that smells mineral and stale. Your modern idea of respectful distance vanishes there. Mortuary behavior in that setting would have been intimate, physical, heavy. Homo naledi is disturbing, not because it gives us a clear answer, but because it does not. It sits there, deep underground, refusing to stay in the box we built for it. None beverten. The first art, and the question, that breaks all the other questions, which brings us to the final mystery, and maybe the most dangerous one because it breaks the categories themselves. What was the first art? Seems like a simple question. It is not. Maybe it is the 45,500-year-old pig painting in Sulawesi, one of the oldest known figurative paintings. Maybe it is older abstract marks. Maybe Neanderthal engravings. Maybe ochre used in ways that were partly symbolic, partly practical. Maybe beads. Maybe handprints. Maybe those Quesang traces from children on travertine, if you want to push the definition. Scientists argue because the word art keeps slipping in their hands. Here is the final reframe. Art did not mean something made to be admired from a distance. Art meant taking inner attention and putting it outside the body. Once you define it that way, the whole timeline gets unstable. A line scratched into bone might count if it carried intention beyond utility. Pigment on skin might matter as much as pigment on cave walls. A bead might be adornment, but adornment is not trivial. It is social code. It is visible identity. It says something to somebody. The reason scientists still fight over this is not because they are being fussy for fun. It is because the question forces a deeper one. What kind of mind do we need to see before we say yes, that is recognizably human expression? And every time the evidence pushes earlier, or appears in a different species, or comes wrapped in ambiguity, our emotional stakes leak out. We do not just want to know when art began. We want to know when we began, but maybe that is the wrong demand. Maybe the prehistoric world is not offering us a neat origin point at all. Maybe it is offering a gradient. Play becoming pattern, pattern becoming mark, mark becoming signal, signal becoming memory, memory becoming shared space becoming ritual. And all along the way, none of it needs permission from modern museum culture to be real. Clean is culture. Home is culture. Art is culture. Respect for the dead is culture. Even the shape of intelligence, when you think you can recognize it at a glance, is partly culture. None of those things are universal in the forms you inherited. They are local solutions with good branding, and that is why these prehistoric mysteries keep making scientists question everything. Not because the past is magical. Not because every unknown needs a fantasy answer, but because the evidence keeps forcing the same quiet admission. Normal is a moving target, and our ancestors, along with our extinct relatives, were often far stranger, more adaptable, and more mentally alive than the modern ego was prepared to grant them. If you could step into their world, you would not arrive as the obvious pinnacle. You would arrive as an oddly scented, soft-handed, overconfident primate who cannot read the ground, and that might be the healthiest thought prehistory can give you.